Hey everybody, welcome to Practical Alchemy. Today's episode is going to be an introduction to inserting 2D assets into Fusion 360. That is going to include JPEGs, SVGs, and DXF file formats. I'm going to first be talking you through the basics of each file type and also the advantages and disadvantages of each and which context you may want to use one over the other. So if you're only looking for information on a specific import type, I will link the time codes here. But if you're here for the whole thing, let's start off with JPEGs. So in order to insert a JPEG, what you're going to do is come up here to the Canvas option. And when you click on there, it's going to bring up the File Explorer. From the File Explorer, you are going to click on the image you want to use. So in this case, I'm actually going to show you what I started with, which was the sketch of this little JPEG icon here. And once you've selected that, it's going to pull up the dialog box where you can now select the face that you would like to place this image on. So I'm going to select the front face here. And once you've done that, you're going to see that the dialog box has expanded and you're going to have a lot more options, which are pretty self-explanatory. You've got the canvas opacity here, which is going to change the opacity. You have the display through option. So basically what this means is that once you start modeling, the display through is either going to show up when the object is in front of it, or will any geometry that exists in the workspace occlude the sketch that you are seeing. So if you want to be able to see it at all times, even when you've got geometry on top of it, you would select that display through option. All right, below that, what you have are all of your positioning options here, which you can also manipulate via all of the manipulators here. So anything that you change with the manipulator is also going to change in the dialog box. So I'm going to move to the front view here, and you can see that my options are to move it along the y-axis and the x-axis. I have the ability to rotate, and I have the ability to scale it either along the x-axis, the y-axis, or I can scale it proportionally by grabbing the corner handle here. I can also move it along the x and y-axis simultaneously by clicking the box here. All right, and I also have the option to flip this if I am looking at it in the opposite direction. So once I've got all of that, you don't really have to be too specific there when you first start, and you are just going to hit OK. And as you can see here, right, the primary reason that you would want to import an image or a canvas into the workspace is so that you can take what would be a image file that has no geometry data associated with it and create geometry based on it. So in this case, I've got this rough sketch that I developed for my JPEG, and now I want to create 3D geometry. Now that I've got it inside of the workspace and I can use it as a reference, the next question is, well, how big is it? I don't really have a very good sense of how big this JPEG actually is in the workspace. And as you know, once you start to model, you are going to need to constrain and dimension any sketches and geometry you create. So what I can do is by going over to the canvases option here, I'm going to right click on this JPEG and I'm going to click calibrate. Now what calibrate is going to do is it's going to bring up the manipulator icon here, and it's going to ask me to click 2 points. So I'm just going to select 2 horizontal points in this image, and then it brings up a dimensioning box. So I can put in what I want that dimension to be. So in this example, I want this to be 1.5 inches, let's say, tall, and hit enter. Now, from here, what I can do is I can create a new sketch. I'm also going to place this into the front plane, and I'm going to create a very simple rectangle. And as you can see, once I dimension this rectangle at 1.5 inches, it is actually going to match up with the dimensions of that sketch, roughly. Now I say roughly because I may not have selected those points exactly when I drew this image. I may not have drawn this particularly accurately. So there is going to be some repositioning and manipulation of your image once you start to lay out this sketch. So for example, I know that I want this sketch to be centered on the origin. So I'm going to come in here. I am going to create my midpoint and move that to my origin. All right. And now, yes, I do have this 1.5 inch tall rectangle, but I really need this JPEG to be in the right place. And what's really cool about this canvases feature is that I can actually go back and edit that canvas while I am still actively working in this sketch. So for example, now that I have it constrained to the right width, I'm going to pull this down. I'm going to position it where I want it. I'm going to hit OK. And now I can continue to dimension my sketch. So from here, you can be as loose or as accurate to that initial sketch as you want, adding dimensions and constraints as you need to. But I'm just going to work very quickly here just to show you the gist of it. Using this sketch as a reference, I am going in and creating all of this as geometry. All right, now I'm going to finish this sketch and hide this canvas. And as you can see, I've gone from an image to an actual geometry that I can use to create an extrusion. There you go. And you can always toggle that JPEG on and off as you continue to work. So now that I've got this sketch, you can see where that display through comes in handy because I can still see where I positioned that JPEG graphic, and I could potentially add a font on top. All right, now adding one image and then creating a sketch geometry around that is really cool. But where this canvas feature can be really powerful is when you are starting to create more complex objects. So for example, let's say I am creating a Ghostbusters neutrino wand. And so I found this really awesome image that I can use. And so I'm going to insert this into a sketch. All right, I'm not going to dimension it at this point. I think you understand how to do that. But I've got the side view drawing here. All right. And I'm going to hit OK. Now I can also come in and not only add the side drawing, but also the top view and any other views that I may need. So I'm going to rotate this. Going to calibrate these images and line them up so that they match in 3D space using this central cylinder as my alignment point. And now what you can see is because I've got multiple sketch geometries here, it's very useful for me as I start to block out these bodies to be able to refer to multiple objects simultaneously. So I can create this main body block here, finish this sketch, and as I extrude outward, I know how far out I need to move in each direction. So I think this illustrates how powerful using canvases can be for playing out more complex geometry from sketches and drawings as you start your modeling process. All right, so now that we've talked about some of the advantages of using the canvas feature, what are some of the disadvantages to using canvases? Well, the first thing to keep in mind whenever you're doing canvases is that the quality that you put in is the quality that you're going to get out. So for example, let's say instead of that really nice looking sketch that I had found this image of this JPEG block online, and it was very, very low quality, very pixelated, right? If I'm starting off with a really pixelated image, no amount of scaling is going to solve that. It's always going to be a very pixelated image. So remember, put good in, get good out. The other issue that you're going to run into when creating geometry from images is when you've got artwork that is really complicated. So for example, I've got this art file here that I call the Nightmare Catcher. You'll see why in a second. Let's say I have this dream catcher All right, and I want to try to create this. Yeah, good luck. All right, so looking at this, you know, the pattern, really not too complicated. I could probably do a couple of circles and create that geometry. Where this is really starting to get complicated is, what am I going to do once I have to start getting in here and creating these feathers? I mean, the amount of line work and splines that I'm going to have to create and manipulate and drag around and manage to create this is just overwhelming. And then you come in here, you've got to try to create this font. It's just, Fusion 360 and this sketch geometry environment is just really not designed to go to this level of complexity. You can do it, but it is not the best way to do it. You would be much better off going into a program like Adobe Illustrator or another vector editing program to create this. So for example, I've actually done that. You can see that this is the artwork that I've created, and I have saved this out as an SVG file. So moving on, topic-wise, we are going to use this to now start to talk about an SVG. Before we talk about how to import SVG files, I do want to take a second to give a brief overview of the SVG file format. This is something that you're going to see a lot if you're downloading files for maybe a Cricut cutter or a laser cutter. And while it is a vector-based file format, in my opinion, it's not really designed for the drafting or CAD environment, so it does have a few quirks that we're going to talk about. Okay, back to the tutorial. Unlike my JPEGs, when I come up and click on Insert, I'm going to go down to SVG. All right, and I'm going to, from my computer, insert this Dreamcatcher SVG file. Just like with the canvases, it is going to ask me for a sketch plane. And once I've got that, it is going to bring up a larger dialog box. And this dialog box is going to allow me to adjust the position in space, both along the y-axis and the x-axis. I can use the block to free rotate, and I can use the corner manipulator to scale this artwork here. And now I can place it into my canvas. All right. And once I've got it in a location that I think is great, I hit OK. Now, unlike my JPEG image that I had to go through and create the geometry for the sketch, you can see that this is actually now created as a sketch geometry. So all of these lines have geometry and they can be manipulated. Now, when you first import an SVG file, you are going to notice that everything is green. And green, as you can see, does not really allow me, even in the sketch panel, does not allow me to manipulate these points. In order to be able to manipulate them, I'm going to have to select everything, right click, and I'm going to unfix. So once I unclick this, you can see that everything has turned blue and it is now freely manipulated, editable geometry. All right, I don't want to spend too much time on the Dreamcatcher, so instead, let's finish this sketch, hide it, and instead, let's go back to our main example, and I'm going to insert an SVG file that I created for this test, and I'm going to hit OK. All right, so now I've got my SVG here that I can create. Now, a couple other things beyond the initial dialog box that I want to show you when it comes to using SVG files. With an SVG file, it is coming in as sketch geometry, which means that I can come in and I can actually manipulate these points. And I can also add some additional design elements. So for example, I can come in and add a diagonal here and a diagonal here so that I can identify the center point of this artwork. Now, the next thing that you'll notice about the SVG files is that unlike the canvases, which I can go in and edit by moving around on the screen and adjusting the scale, SVGs are coming in as a sketch. So while I can go in and edit the sketch, when I hit edit, it doesn't give me that same dialog box. I'm now dealing with blue, so completely unconstrained sketch geometry that I need to adjust as sketch geometry. The first thing to keep in mind here is that since this is all unconstrained, you have to be very careful about not selecting and dragging individual points unless you want to, because it will destroy your art. All right. And if you want to come in and move this around, what you do is you click and drag to select all of it, and then you're going to come down to the Modify panel, move and copy, and now you can see that it's going to bring up a manipulator that is going to allow me to move, rotate, and drag. What I want to call your attention to here is that you can actually change the move type, and I can go point to point, and that is really, really helpful in moving positionally. So for example, let's say I want to move this to the origin. I can actually select this lightning bolt point. Here is the first point, and then I select the origin, and it will snap it. That's really useful in adjusting the position of my geometry. All right. There's actually one other way that you can move SVG objects around, which is to not be in the sketch mode, but to actually from the Modify panel here, select Move and Copy, and you can actually select sketch objects. So to select the sketch object, I can just click and drag here. All right. And now I can click and drag this around in the same manner. The advantage here, and I would very much recommend that you use this to move your sketch around versus doing it in the actual sketch itself, is that this is not going to accidentally constrain any of these points. You need all of these points to be unconstrained in order to move this around freely. In fact, the first time I tried to do this demo, it accidentally constrained this edge point to the origin, and I had to go back and delete a bunch of stuff. The other way that you may want to manipulate is to scale. So in order to scale this sketch geometry, what you're going to have to do is go back into the sketch mode. All right. You can go up to the Modify command here, and you can stretch scale. So again, select all the entities. It's going to ask you the point which you're going to want to scale around. So in this case, we actually want it to be the origin. All right, and now you can see that I can click and drag to scale this up and down. So let's use a quick practical example. Let's say that I have a 6" by 6" block that I want to emboss this SVG file into. What I would do first in this situation is create essentially a bounding box sketch. All right, so this is a fully dimensioned sketch that calls out where the box is and where it's located in 3D space. From there, I can go down to my SVG file. I can modify it by selecting the sketch objects here. And with my frame turned on, I can move this around so that it is roughly positioned where I want it. Click OK. Then I'm going to go into the sketch itself. I'm going to modify the scale by selecting everything. I'm going to scale it around the origin point. And now I can turn my frame reference back on and scale my sketch down to the right size. Okay. I'm going to finish the sketch, and I'm actually going to go back, select it again, and translate these to be a little bit more centered. All right. And there we have it. Sketch is laid out on my base. All right, so now let us talk about the first of the two main problems with SVG file. Let's go ahead and extrude this block here. So I'm going to click on extrude, and you can see the problem, right? When I click on this, something's wrong with this V here, right? It's not showing up as closed geometry. And I know that when I exported it, it was a closed letter. I mean, there is apparently not closed geometry. What's happening here? Let's cancel this. Let's go back into this sketch, and I'm going to zoom in really close. You see it yet? No? Let's zoom in a little closer. A little closer. A little closer. Look at that. Right there. This is not closed. There's some type of corruption that happened with the exporting of the SVG file that has made this not only unclosed, but also given it this really weird point. So I'm going to go back in and delete that just for the sake of the example, and I'm going to create some new geometry, zoom back out, finish the sketch, and let's see if that fixed the problem. I'm going to extrude here and So just like that. All right, and it worked. All right, we've got our SVG file. Great. But that's a big problem, especially when we start talking about some more complicated things like this or font. You don't really want to be going through and fixing all of these SVG files. This happens all the time with SVGs. They have a very high tendency of having these weird corruptions and not clean data that gets imported. So just be aware of that when you're importing SVG files, that you may have to go in and modify and clean up some of that artwork. All right. The second big problem with SVG files, as I think you probably have already started to notice by me having to do all of this clicking and scaling, is that SVG, and there's the same issue with the canvases, by the way. This is not perfect, right? I can do a lot of futzing to adjust this scale, and I can, move this thing around and tweak it and, go back in and do the decimal points. But we're talking about geometry and getting things lined up pixel perfect. It's a pain to do that with SVG files because they're not dimensioned. There's a lot of clicking and dragging, and there is an inherent impreciseness to using an SVG file. In fact, I'm going to give you an additional example to show this. So I'm going to turn that SVG file off for a second, and I'm going to jump back to Illustrator to show the original artwork. This is the artwork that I created in Illustrator for this SVG file, and this artwork has been dimensioned at 7 inches wide by 5.5 inches tall, and it has been exported from Illustrator as an SVG. Let's go back and let's import that SVG file one more time. All right, same one. All right. I'm not going to do anything to the dimensions here. I'm going to hit OK, and let us just see what the dimensions as imported are. Ready? Look at that, 5.25 inches. 5.25 inches. That's not 7 inches, right? This did not come in at full scale. And actually, let's come in and grab our calculator here. So let's say 7 inches divided by 5.25. Yikes. 1.333 repeating. That's an infinite number, which means I can't even come in here and scale this to the right dimensions. I could unconstrain this and I could scale it up to, biofactor of 1.333, and it's going to get pretty close to 1 inch, but it's never going to be exactly 1 inch. So that's the biggest problem with SVG files, is that they do not come in with dimensional data associated with them. Which brings us to the third file type that we are going to be talking about, which is the DXF file. DXF files come from CAD. They are designed to be CAD files and CAD line drawings. Now, the import process for a DXF file is exactly the same. I can insert this as a DXF file. It's going to ask me for the file, and I'm actually going to use this loader file here. Hit open. All right, and now it's going to ask me the sketch plane or planes that I would like to use. What you're going to see here is kind of a jumbled mess, and that is because I built everything for this tutorial in the same Illustrator file and exported it as a single DXF file. And that's good because I want to show you that with DXF files, you have the option to turn off layers that you don't want and not import them. So I actually do want this DXF layer. I don't want any of the JPEGs or the SVG artwork, but I do want this DFX artwork. All right. And I have the option to insert that either as a single sketch or as one sketch per layer. So as you can see, as we come back to the file here, that I have the main artwork is one sketch, but I've got the frame as a second piece of artwork. So for example, let's say I want to make this art into a business card or wallet card size. Well, I want to make sure that this artwork is perfectly 3.37 by 2.125 inches, which are the dimensions of a credit card. So let's go back to our Fusion 360 document. I'm going to select these two objects. I'm going to move them around a little bit just so that I'm working vaguely in the center of the screen, and then I'm going to hit OK. All right, so moment of truth. Remember, we were saying that the big problem with our SVG files is that they do not carry the proper dimensions. So will this sketch, as imported, meet our dimensions? So, click and drag, and look at that, perfect, 3.37 inches. You can be confident if you create full-scale vector artwork in something like Adobe Illustrator or Inkscape, that when you export as DXF, it will come in the right size. Now, let's talk about file manipulation. Same as with the SVG files. Once I've got this imported, it's going to come in as blue unconstrained geometry. So I have the ability to modify this geometry if I want to. I can add additional geometry to it, and I can also take geometry away that I don't want. Scaling is going to happen the exact same way. If I want to scale things, I will select them, go up to the Modify tab, Sketch Scale, select the modification point. I'm going to scale around. It has to be something that's not selected, by the way. Otherwise, it won't work. If you're clicking, you keep clicking and dragging and not understanding why it's not working, that's because you've selected a point that you've selected as part of your scale, and so it's breaking it. And you can also reposition it inside the sketch by selecting everything, moving copy, and then you can drag it around. All right, I'm actually going to delete this part of the sketch because really all I'm concerned about is the credit card size portion. Okay, I want to circle back to an advantage of the DXF file format that I touched on briefly, which is the ability to import each layer as a separate sketch. This is really useful because it just makes it much easier to separate all the things that you are selecting versus having everything tied up in the exact same sketch. All right, so last thing that I want to mention regarding DXF files is if you are going to be importing things as multiple sketches, just keep in mind that I would highly recommend that if you're going to reposition things, don't do that from inside the sketch itself. Because if I start to do that and not everything is in the same sketch, I run the risk of having things no longer aligned. So for example, if I move the interior components here, but I haven't moved the outer frame, that's going to be a problem. You'd be much better off going from the modification menu. That way you can select sketch objects from multiple sketches and move those around much more confidently. Now, the very last thing that I'd like to mention is that when it comes to scaling sketches, if you don't have any other programs available, obviously you can scale using the transformation options inside the sketch. But it really would be ideal for you to adjust those drawings inside of some type of vector editing program like Adobe Illustrator, because it's much easier to adjust dimensions in there. Now, the exact process of doing that is outside of the scope of this video, but something that I can certainly address in the future. All right, let's do a quick summary before we wrap it up for today. Inserting a canvas is the option to go with if you are working from a JPEG or picture to use as an underlay or as a series of underlays to build 2D and 3D geometry. However, this option will start to break down when the geometry becomes overly complicated. In this scenario, you are much better using a vector editing program to export an SVG file, which can be imported directly as sketch geometry, which you can then start to manipulate and edit. The big problem with the SVG file format is that it does not contain dimensionality. So if you are very specific in terms of the sizes that you need, you are much better off going with a DXF file, which contains geometry and can be imported as multiple sketches simultaneously, making it much better for creating three-dimensional geometry that needs to be precise and exact in its sizing. And that is going to wrap it up for today. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. If you have any questions or content that you'd like to see in future videos, leave those in the comments sections. And as always, hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with new content releases and continue modeling with practical alchemy. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. And don't forget to hit save.